Hi, welcome to Lines and Spaces. I'm Michaela.
And I'm Jason.
This is our third take, I would just like you to know. We had a small brain malfunction. But we're happy to be here, and we're going to be talking about lesson planning, another place where small brain breakdowns happen.
Yes. But before we get into our main topic for today, it has been a while since we last seen you, Michaela. How have you been?
I have been well, Jason. I was doing a little bit of performing. So just because you start teaching full time does not mean you have to stop performing and doing music things that you love, in addition to the teaching that you love so much.
Yes, and I will also say Michaela was phenomenal in her performance that I was able to see. She did a really awesome job. And though we missed her last week, she was doing something great and sharing some great music with the community that we are both relatively in. But hopping back over to more important things, lesson planning. Why we decided to kind of talk about this topic is both Michaela and I will be starting our first full-time teaching position in a couple of, I guess, a couple days for me, and I think a couple weeks for, or a week or two for you.
Yeah.
And what's on our mind more than anything nowadays is curriculum planning, lesson planning, and what the heck we're gonna do in the classroom when students start coming in.
Yes, we got the job, and the question is now what?
Yes, exactly. So, on the topic of lesson planning, Michaela, what are some things that go into making a lesson plan?
Jason, I'm so glad you asked. The basic ingredients of a lesson plan are objectives, so what you want to accomplish and what you want the students to accomplish, standards, so these are things that should go alongside your objectives that basically state um, information that is agreed upon nationwide and or statewide as important to teach students all over the country, across the state, whichever types of standards you're using. Your procedure is your next ingredient. So that's basically the breakdown of steps, how you're going to accomplish your goals. And then assessment. So you know what your students have learned, how effective you were in teaching it. And after that, while you're planning this lesson, Jason, what are some of the things you're supposed to take into consideration?
Yeah, so but alongside those like big bullet points you have on your lesson plan, you're also thinking about the grade level that you're working with, the population of students that you're kind of interacting with as well, the accessibility of your lesson if you're doing different activities, if you have special needs individuals or individuals who have needs elsewhere, modification and adaptation should also be kind of put into the lesson so that if somebody were to look at it they can see those modifications, and also thinking about universal design so that everything is accessible for your students to be able to engage with at a level that is the same so that no one student is getting more out of the lesson than another. And of course students will be at different levels throughout that, but thinking about how you can make the lesson accessible and thinking about those modifications and adaptations will be super important. And then, of course, materials, classroom setup, repertoire, and spaces for reflection. What the goal is, again, those things that Michaela had mentioned, those objectives, will align with, I think, for music. If you go to NAFME, the National Association for Music Education, they have our set standards, which the broad categories are creating, performing, responding, and connecting. So those are your, I guess, national standards. And then statewide standards, I believe they're just art standards for different states, are things to kind of just check in with your state about. But they're relatively broad if you've read through them. They're broad so that you have room to be creative still with how you're planning those things out.
So, Jason, what types of techniques do you use when you're planning lessons?
So, the first thing that I always think about when planning a lesson, regardless of the subject, is what the musical elements that I will be touching on. So like we talk about rhythm, pitch, melody, and all those things. Thinking about what do you want to touch on, and then breaking it down to its simplest thing, because you never want to assume that your students know something. I've done that in the past, and I've had to explain things to students. So why not just have that implanted into your lesson, so that while you're explaining, if students do understand it, you can pick up the pace to push along the lesson. So I always start planning by thinking about the lowest common denominator about what students understand, so that everybody's on the same page when we start getting into more complicated material. Um, so yeah, once you have that set up and the overall concept you're touching on, then you start thinking about what repertoire you're going to use to support that from instrumental setting and also a general music setting. So if you're talking about, let's say, rhythm, you're going to learn about being in duple meter. that's your concept. Your concept is rhythm, duple meter is the goal, and breaking that down. I always think about get them to experience what that is first, and then add on repertoire to help either counter it or just a song by itself. So those are kind of like the intro steps to what I think about when planning out lessons. But Michaela, is there anything else you want to kind of throw on there for techniques for lesson planning?
Absolutely. So, lesson planning is something that I know I struggle with very often. Um, but the best advice I could give myself, and perhaps it would be helpful to somebody listening, is to start broad and then get really specific. Um, I tend to kind of overwhelm myself with the excitement of so many things that you could do that I can't figure out what to do. Um, but when I start with the big picture, and sometimes I need to go as far back as to remind myself, why am I here? Why am I teaching music? Why this topic? Why should it matter to them? Um, and going from there and getting really specific into in Jason's example for working on rhythms. Why do they need to know rhythms? Make sure they know why they need to know rhythms. And then build off of that, start with the review and dive right into set them up for success into the new content. Additionally, I've learned from painful experience, it's important to have backup activities ready to go at a moment's notice in case you speed through the procedure you had planned, or in case the procedure you had planned is not working at all. Your students are not having it that day for whatever reason. It's raining, it's sunny, I don't know. But sometimes they're just not going to have it. So to have things ready for emergencies is crucial. And um, I found it extremely beneficial when I started adding in on my lesson planning documents space to reflect on what went well and what did not go as I hoped it would, so that when I'm planning the following lesson, I can tweak it, change things to allow myself to be more responsive in the moment as well as in preparing for the students I'm working with.
Yeah, and going off that, I think, yeah, Michaela, that was very well put. Definitely should have. I was like, oh, yeah, specific first, but no, definitely broad first, and then build it down. And something that going off of what you mentioned, that reflection portion, I think that's like the biggest kind of difference between what we were doing in school and what we can kind of apply now to when we're planning our own lessons. Because in school, you're expected to reflect. You have a sometimes you're even given a rubric or even a format of how you plan your lesson out. Whereas now we aren't held up to having one of those, and we kind of get to pick and choose of what we want to put into ours. And I would definitely say a reflection portion so that you can change and adjust your lessons for your next lesson is super important in getting the ball rolling and planning those things out as well.
Yeah. And on the topic of that reflection, that's something that one of our professors had told us is really important, self-reflection and that type of thing. And I couldn't agree more in my own experience again. And like I went as basic as to literally type things that students said in class on a lesson plan after I finished using the lesson plan. So I could go back and see, oh, okay, well, when I said this, they understood it as this, but I meant it like that. Or I even would write down, there was a lot of talking in this corner of the room when this topic was brought up, or just throughout the class, this was going on in this part of the room. So that when I'm planning for the next lesson for that given class, I'd be able to look and see, oh, I need to pay extra close attention to what's going on over here because last time they had trouble. So there's no limit to how specific and detailed you can get in reflecting on what happened after you taught and
Yeah,
while you were teaching
I did that before too, like having like a pile of post-it notes on my computer, just be like, okay,
and
this
confirm.
class, this time, over here. Yeah, I had shown Michaela while we were in student teaching at least my like
An
setup.
overwhelming amount of
There's a
post-it notes
bunch of post-it
all
notes
over
around
on
my
me.
screen. And yeah, those things kind of help me like get things in order, though it's like chaotic, but like organized chaos is what I like to call it. Um, but yeah, those things, keeping those things in mind so that you can plan for it and also just be aware and kind of build it into a routine so that you're always prepared to deal with issues that happen in the classroom that could have happened or things that you may want to try to fix for next time. That kind of comes down to kind of the next kind of thing that I want to kind of talk about what goes into a lesson plan, the techniques, is thinking about your pacing and your transitions. Think about what your intro activity is going to be, your core activity, so the main goal activity, And then if I know that for general music, you'll have like a bunch of main goals, and then you'll transition into those, and you have like a final closing activity so that it kind of wraps up the lesson for the day. And of course, that doesn't mean you have to wrap up everything for the day. It could mean it continues to the next lesson that focuses on the same topic as well. From like an instrumental, I guess, musical standpoint for those, a lot of times your intro will be a warm up that is related to the main activity, and that main activity will probably take up the majority of your time, whatever you're focused on. And then your closer may just be playing through that section or singing through that section that you're working on as well. So it
Which
could,
doubles as like an assessment too.
yeah,
Perhaps an informal assessment, but an assessment nonetheless.
yeah. So like I know that we're talking about a lot of things here. Lesson planning, there's so much that can go into it. But at the end of the day, it's like your assessment portion of what you're measuring. You have your topics at the beginning. What do you want to achieve? And then the procedures and getting to that point of the assessment or that final goal. And of course, your lesson plan, I've noticed this too. A lot of times, I would write a lesson plan out that was supposed to be for one class, and I maybe get through half of it. And then you have to take what you didn't get to for your next lesson and think about what you have to review before the start of class to set up the next lesson so that they have a review and they can build on from there. And just getting into that routine of being like, okay, we got to this point, we didn't get to here, what did we get to? So at your next lesson, you can do a quick review and then go on from there. And also, of course, that review also helps you get an order of what students may have struggled with, what they understood, what they remember, and what they didn't remember.
Mm-hmm. So we touched a little bit on assessment. Um, I mentioned informal assessment. So there's formal and informal assessment. Jason, could you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. So yeah, on top of assessment, informal assessment is it's not something you write down or you kind of grade right away. You don't give like a point score to it. Is what I remember, what I like to think about. And what you're basically doing is just quickly like listening and be like, okay, you noticed something and you made like a mental note of it. Like informal assessment that I like to do is when you're just performing something, maybe you hear something from a section, you're like, okay, making note of that something was wrong there, or something we need a correction there. That's an informal assessment. Something that's like a quick check on there, but you don't have to like you don't have to like
It's not a
what's
grade.
yeah, it's not like a specific
It's not
grade
a
like
technical
number.
grade.
Yeah,
More like a participation type thing. You know,
yeah.
it's are you doing the thing? Great. Then make a note of how you can improve it or how what they need from you. Whereas a formal assessment is more of the number scores and very specific.
Mm, yeah. Listen to what Michaela just said because I was explaining
You
that
made
very poorly.
perfect sense.
My brain
Perfect
is
sense.
very off right now. But yeah, and we use both without even noticing it. I think
Mm-hmm.
informal assessment is, for me at least, 80% of the assessment that I do is informal.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
it's something that's happening all the time because you're listening and responding to your students.
mhm,
It's
yeah,
happening without even realizing it.
yeah. And the feedback that you give after the informal assessment is kind of what the goal is. You're assessing it quickly, then you give feedback, assessing it again to see if that feedback stuck. If it didn't, change the wording or re-explain it or do something different. And if it did, you can kind of move on from there. Whereas I've always felt like formal assessment would be like a playing test where you're grading them for like rhythm, pitch, and like accuracy for those things. Or
Mm.
in the terms of like a general music classroom, it could be like a project. Like let's say you were doing a project about the history of jazz or choosing a jazz composer or a Broadway singer and just like doing an autobiography about them because your topic was jazz or musical and Broadway and stuff. Because you're grading for specific things
Yeah.
that you're looking for.
There's so many different types of assessments as well within formal and informal. One type of assessment that I was introduced to while student teaching with much younger students was it was an active listening activity, which they colored on a coloring page based on what they were hearing. So they used red if they heard violins, and they used blue if they heard a flute, and like only one was correct. But it was basically a color in by numbers, which was a really interesting way to assess um, the students' understanding of different instruments and different timbres, but a way that was really effective and they definitely enjoyed doing. Additionally, something else I was introduced to, or something that was kind of brought to my attention as a way of assessing where your students are at, is letting them assess themselves, giving them a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 4. Like one, you have no idea what's going on. 4, you could do whatever the thing is in your sleep. And then, like, show me on your hand, like, what's your comfort level with this? And that helps them to take a little more ownership over what they're doing and to help realize and become more self aware of what they could be doing or what they need help on so that they can start communicating with you better and you can help them in a way that is more effective.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, the whole of giving them self reflecting on themselves. This is both for
Yeah,
like
the
the
self
students, yeah,
assessment.
that's your students that you're working with, and also for yourself to kind of self-assess as you're doing these lesson plans. It's something you also think about if you are. Another way of assessing is giving them like rubrics and whatnot, and like having like scored papers and things. When you're making those rubrics and you're planning out those things, like giving, let's say, like the rubric is like a 5 to 1 scale, where like you get a check off for 5, and this is what 5 means. It's like, oh, accurate rhythms, playing with good timbre, whatnot. That could be a 5, and then a 4, and so on downwards. You want to make sure those are very specific, so that they're easily measurable and be and able to listen to, especially for if you're doing auditions and whatnot. Make sure that you have. I've realized this more in the scene of like when you're auditioning for like solos or like parts for musicals, that having a clear expectation of why student A got something over student B can make all the difference. Because I'm sure we've all either experienced it or I've heard it, where parents or students get upset if they don't get the solo or the part that they want, and you have to explain it to them sometimes. And if you have a rubric that is clearly stated of what you are measuring for and of clear reasons of why, maybe you don't tell them why, but you have that set so that it's
You
not.
have a score. You have something
Yes.
that they can actually, some tangible evidence or reasoning as to the choices you make and
Yeah,
how it affects them.
so that they don't feel like it's a biased thing that they chose student A because student A is whatever and student B is whatever. So just keeping those things in mind as you're writing them, keeping them clear, keeping it very specific, and not leaving too much room for kind of that kind of gray area.
Mr. Wu likes this student better than me.
I've had that in the past, and um, most times it is true, but yeah, yeah, I've recognized that more and more, that if we're doing like large projects or group projects using like Soundtrap or other things as well. This is kind of in the realm of like upper level general music things. You want to keep in mind of what your specific goals are and what you're looking out for, so that it can be measured. Because I've also like general music, unless upper general music, your grading scale is less your grading scale is different than if you were doing an ensemble. Because the ensemble is always, you have your playing test sometimes and you have your performance. But in a project based kind of curriculum, like some general music courses are, it's project based. So you have to grade accordingly based on what the goals of the project were, and did those students hit those goals. Because unfortunately, though, I'm not a advocate for grading in music and grading creativity. You need to be able to provide that information for your supervisors, your principal, just so that they know. Because at the end of the day, most students are getting letter grades, unfortunately, and even in art or music, they're also getting letter grades.
Right.
Yeah,
So, to close us out in the topics of lesson planning, um, in a lesson, you have to determine what you want, your objectives, how you'll get to those objectives, your procedure, and figure out, did it work with your assessment. And when you're planning your objectives, it's probably a good idea to think about how you want to assess at the end of the lesson or throughout the lesson to see if you've achieved those objectives, and just be really, really specific as much as you can. And everything you can, be really specific in what you want to happen so you know what you're looking for.
yeah. The more that you can get out of that broad zone and get down to center, for this, over like a lesson that's like a one lesson thing, is gonna be super helpful and like just getting everything focused and kind of also kind of closing things out. while we're both in the state of like planning for like a full year of curriculum and whatnot, definitely very helpful to kind of plan in chunks because I think someone mentioned this before. It's a common phrase. The lesson was like you can only control. No wait, the I'm gonna restate it again. Your lesson plan is there as a guide, but what can happen sometimes is you walk into a classroom, you start, and then nothing works. The only thing that's guaranteed in your lesson plan is the first thing that you do. Everything else just kind of goes. And I think teachers and music teachers and all teachers in general are really great improvisers of just switching things on the fly and being able to adapt and change topics if needed because it is so unexpected in what we need to get out of the lesson. And you can plan all you want for a lesson, but at the end of the day, if it may or may not happen, and you have to be able to adapt and modify and change on the fly to what the students are giving you because at the end of the day the goal is to make sure that they are learning and they are understanding they're also having fun, especially in a musical setting. Let them have fun with it, and if you stay on a topic for too long, it's okay. If the students are having fun with it, I've always, if they're enjoying playing the section or they're enjoying doing something, I'm like, no, let's just continue with this for a little bit. Let them realize that you appreciate what they enjoy so that you can kind of build it on from there and kind of build that level of like, oh, it's like a give and a take, teach you had to give them something, they take it, and then in the more that you kind of get that relationship going, it becomes much easier for students to do things for you in a lesson that may not be as fun or as exciting as they may want it to be.
Well, thank you for joining us in Lines and Spaces talking about lesson plans. And we're looking forward to talking some more in our next episode.
Yes, and thank you so much for everybody keeping it up to date with us on season two. We've been getting some great feedback and some great viewership, and it's very refreshing to kind of see people listening in on us and thinking, kind of just hearing what we have to say about this beautiful world of music education with it being so ever changing and kind of also coming along with us through our journey of learning what it is to be a music educator in now the professional field because we are now out of school and technically, oh, I guess we're in school still, different
We're
setting.
about to be in a new school.
Yeah. So I think we're starting our 17th. I'm starting my 17th year of school.
Something like that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening in this week. We will see you next time. Bye bye.
Bye.